Hello there, this is Mr. Benchy again. In this tutorial, I will demonstrate how to solve problems under the banner of group frequency distribution tables. Again, quick reminder, a typical group frequency distribution table, the way that they differ from your frequency distribution tables is this. Frequency distribution tables, by definition, they indicate exactly the frequency of relative scores. So you know exactly how many times a certain x shows up in the distribution. In the situation of group frequency distribution tables, you see these numbers indicating the range in which the x scores fall within. So let's take a look at the question here. As a TA, you supported a professor in grading the final exams for one of their classes. The marks for these exams range from a high of x equals 91 to a low of x equals 53. And with the information supplied so far, assuming that the question asks you to figure out the range, R-A-N-G-E, the range of the scores, well, the procedure is quite straightforward. You would take the smallest number from the largest number. Okay, that's the math, 91 subtracting 53. That's the answer to what is the range. Let's keep going. You were instructed to place these scores in a group frequency distribution table with an interval width of 5 points. In this case, the bottom and top intervals in the table would be, now keep in mind the question has already supplied us with all the sufficient information to determine an answer there. So we're figuring out the lowest interval that we will be using in constructing such a group frequency distribution table, as well as the highest interval. Now, first of all, we need to take into consideration the information given us so far. Number one, the top score. Okay? Let me just quickly indicate the top score right there. The top score, there. Okay? That is to say, there would be a certain range that would have to account for the top score of 91. There will also then be various different intervals. Let me just quickly write this down. Okay, so assuming that this is an interval, so we've got various different intervals, and x number of intervals. So we've got the top interval, which must include the score, this score, the score of x equals 91. We will also need the bottom interval right there to include the score 53. You with me so far? Okay, so that's the setup right there. That's the setup right there. Just want to quickly indicate. Clearly, we've got the top interval and the bottom. Okay, and our task is to figure out what the top interval is, and we'll describe, well, every interval is described by the range of numbers involved. Okay, the range of numbers involved, and we'll have to determine what the top category is as well as the bottom category. Okay, top interval and the bottom interval. Now to do this, there's another piece of information that we need. The last piece of information we need, which is already provided in the question, is this: interval width of 5 points. The interval width of 5 points. As a reminder, you've probably seen this information before, but let's just do a quick review. There are several guidelines in determining what exactly the intervals look like when it comes to certain information provided, putting together a group frequency distribution table that makes sense, that is functional in presenting and representing the numbers clearly in a meaningful fashion. A few guidelines. Number one, the first guideline, you'll have to consider the golden rule of using about roughly 10 class intervals. It can be slightly less, can be slightly more, but roughly, okay? Roughly about 10 class intervals. Again, a class interval is an interval, as I demonstrated just moments ago. So roughly 10 intervals in any distribution. Okay, it could be less, it could be less, it could be more, depending on the question. Okay, sometimes in certain situation, 10 would be fine. Other times, maybe somewhere between 7 to 8, possibly. Or if it's a larger population, then maybe it's helpful to go with 12 to 15 class intervals. Okay, there can be various different reasons to support exactly the number of class intervals you include. Okay, that's the first rule anyways. Let's just move on. Now, consider also the second guideline, and that is that the width should be a relatively simple number. By simple, we're referring to the kinds of numbers that when we eyeball the number, we would have a quick sense of the layout. For example, the most typical of simple number, quote unquote, simple numbers that that statisticians would typically consider in the beginning stages is, they include the number 2, the number 5, or even the number 10. Now in the question tells us to use the interval width of 5 points. So this is what we're going to do, 5 points. Okay. The next rule, third guideline to fully consider. The bottom score in each class interval should be a multiple of the width. Okay, bottom score, a multiple of the width. Now, with this piece of information, since referring to guideline number 2, a simple number, 2, 5, or 10, and the question actually indicates very, very clearly for us to use the interval width of 5 points. That is to say, considering guidelines number 2 and 3, we are to consider bottom numbers of every every class interval. Since they need to be multiples of the width, we're talking about the use of numbers, for example, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, and so forth and so forth. Do you see? This is what we're referring to. This is exactly what we're referring to. And yes, there is one last rule which comes as no surprise, I don't believe, that all intervals will need to be of the same, put them in capital letters, same width. Okay, goes without saying almost, but as a reminder, it is one of the key guidelines for us to figure this out. Now, in this situation, let's approach the question and figure out what among the options A, B, and C is the best answer to the question. So we're figuring out exactly what the bottom interval is and the top interval. Okay. Now, if you scour the answer immediately, almost immediately, you can actually eliminate a couple of options already. Options A and C, right off the bat, they do not look good. The interval width of 5 points okay? And as well as guideline number 3, the bottom needs to be multiples of the width. A is not such, C is not such. Look at the bottom of the intervals that option A indicates. There's 53, not exactly a multiple of 5. 94, not exactly a multiple of 5. And it's roughly a similar situation in the case of option C. So right off the bat, we need to eliminate both options A and C. In short, bad answers, okay? Bad answers. There is literally no argument to support, to even consider options A and C. Now, keeping in mind the same rule, interval width of 5 points, as well as the bottom being multiples of 5. Options B and C, they both offer us something to work with. Voila, awesome. This is pretty awesome. This is pretty awesome. Now the problem with option D, is that the intervals given, okay, they are not the width of 5. By a width of 5, we're not talking about the larger number, okay? We're not exactly just talking about the larger number subtracting the smaller number to get the numerical result of 5. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the range representing 5 points. We're talking about the range representing 5 points. Here is where you need to remind yourself in a group frequency distribution table, we do need to consider the upper real limit and the lower real limit, okay? When we consider the upper real limit of 55, for example, well, the upper real limit is actually 55.5. And the lower real limit, which 50 represents, is, this is you recalling information from a previous chapter, 49.5. If you do the math, subtracting 49.5 from 55.5, you actually get the range of 6 points. And not 5. Do you see? 6 points and not 5. And so when fully considering such a concept, B is the best answer. Let's just cross-check the situation. So are we satisfying the first guideline with option B? We are. Because if you think about it, we've got, if we start with the bottom range of 50 to 54, what is the next range? The next would be 55 to 59. On we go, 60 to 64, 65 to 69, 70 to 74, 75 to 79, 80 to 84, 85 to 89, and then the quote-unquote ideal top interval, 90 to 94, which captures the highest score of x equals 91. Are we clear so far? So this very moment, let's just cross-check every guideline, every requirement. So we've done so for the first. What about the second? It is a width of 5. It is a width of 5 between 50 to 54, as well as 90 to 94, fully considering the concept of upper and lower real limits. Check. What about the third guideline? The bottom needs to be multiples of the width. The width, again, as a reminder, it's indicated very clearly in the question, is 5. And 50 as well as 90, they're both intervals of 5. Check. All intervals, they are the same width. Perfect. Do you see exactly how we've arrived at option B as the best answer? I hope this has been clear. I hope this has been helpful. And again, as a quick reminder, nothing is in the way for you to rewatch this tutorial and gain further clarity as well as mastery of the subject matter. More of such will be made available in the foreseeable future. Hit the like and subscribe buttons to stay up to date of quality tutorials that can help you succeed in your studies. You've been watching Mr. Benji at Mr. Benji Now on YT. I'm a college instructor in Vancouver, BC, Canada. Until next time.